Welcome to On the Mind. I'm Austyn.
I'm Duncan.
I'm Bryce.
Today we're going to be talking about Venezuela. Short, brief history, Duncan, about the background, and then we're going to move on to economics, and I'm sure it's going to boil down to capitalism versus socialism, if I know these two at all. So, Duncan, brief history.
Okay, so basically the section of Venezuela's history that we're going to be focusing on goes back to about the 1990s. Now, in this time, Venezuela, much like many other South American countries, was trying to determine whether it was going to have more of an open market economy similar to the way Colombia has gone, or if it was going to follow the Bolivarian model of a semi-state socialism. Out of this came the very famous revolutionary leader Hugo Chavez, who attempted two unsuccessful coups during the early and mid-1990s, before eventually being elected democratically in 1998 and taking office in 1999.
I don't know much about that, but if someone attempted two coups, I'm surprised the government didn't just put them down.
Honestly, if they had been able to very effectively, they probably would have. At the time, you have to remember, this was sort of at the tail end of the era of Marxist-Leninist revolution in the Western world. You still had FARC being very effective in Colombia. You had the Shining Path down in Peru, who were another group of Marxist insurgents. So there was a certain degree, and you also have to remember that Cuba at this time was the major communist nation in the Western world. So there was a lot of support for people like Hugo Chavez, and he did eventually parlay that into an electoral win in 1998.
Okay.
I will add in that the president who imprisoned Hugo Chavez, the guy who was elected president after him, as part of him being elected in, he agreed that he would release Hugo Chavez from prison.
Correct.
Just adding into the history.
Okay, cool. That's actually an interesting bit of knowledge, actually. So how does that translate into what we're talking about today, Duncan?
So Hugo Chavez was probably the single most defining economic force of Venezuela's entire history. He essentially took the entire country from a fairly moderate centrist country. I mean, certainly there was a division within the country as to whether it should go to a more market-based economy or a more state-controlled economy. Under Chavez, it very much took the latter path. And over the course of his rule, which lasted intermittently due to his later health issues until 2013 when he died and his former vice president, Nicolas Maduro, currently the president, took over, he essentially transformed Venezuela from being a more or less market-based economy to a heavily nationalized economy, taking several of the more important industries, not the least of which were the major oil fields in the drainage basin of the Orinoco River. Also, the gold, transportation, the concrete industry was nationalized in 2008, and also large sections of Venezuela's tourism industry, which, much like many other South American countries, it does a thriving business of under normal circumstances. Not so much these days.
Kind of surprised people would even want to go to South America anymore.
Yeah, you have to remember that Venezuela does have part of the northern coastal region of South America, so it does have some excellent beaches, and actually Chavez basically seized several privately owned houses on those beaches and turned them into tourist resorts. State-owned tourist resorts, of course.
I can just sense the disdain in your voice.
I disagree with a lot of what he did.
All right, and Bryce, with the agreement?
I don't agree so much with a lot of state-run policies. A lot of what Duncan was describing, I wouldn't agree with. I wouldn't put those policies into place should I have been in that position. I would like to add, just again, a little bit more on the history that Hugo Chavez did in 2002, I want to say, made the oil industry privatized again. Those three companies took over all of the oil industry in Venezuela. Then eventually they merged into one much larger company. And then Hugo Chavez again seized it under state control.
Correct.
So they formed a monopoly, and he said, I'm not dealing with that.
And it actually should be noted that complete ownership is not within the Venezuelan government's purview at this point. They are the majority shareholder in the Orinoco oil fields, but there are still privatized parts of the businesses. So they're the majority shareholder, but not the exclusive shareholder.
Okay. Awesome. So, are we just gonna get down to it and make this a capitalism versus socialism debate?
Well, do we want to at least talk about what's been going on since
Yeah, there's still
2013
the-
with Nicolas Maduro?
I just feel, from what I've read, Maduro has been rigidly holding Chavez's.
In some regards, he definitely has stuck to a lot of Chavez's ideological grounds. Now, he has adjusted some of the policies.
I remember reading that interview from Torres,
Correct.
and he said Chavez was great at making mid-course adjustments for his policies.
Correct.
And Maduro has been famously horrible at it.
Yeah, although, I mean, the reality is that Hugo Chavez, I know I've said this before, was a man who knew exactly when to die, because his death in 2013 coincided almost exactly with a major, major rush of hyperinflation that had actually been building up since 2011, but that didn't really become the huge problem that it is today until shortly after Maduro had taken office.
I do think we haven't really mentioned that everybody in Venezuela, since a lot of it's state run, is super poor right now and nobody has food and people are starving. We kind of talked for a long time without mentioning what the problems are.
That's right. Didn't they you just told us that they declared a state of emergency?
Yes. So 15% of the population is eating garbage now just to survive. There are a lot of pictures that have been released of grocery stores that are completely empty. The black market is selling most of the food now. If at any point they do import food to the grocery store, it's quickly bought by the black market and they sell it at a much higher price. The funds that go towards food for schools, hospitals, people with disabilities, homes for them, that's now being diverted to other places. I'm not sure where, but they don't have food anymore.
And this is even on top of the fact that not too long ago, the Venezuelan government, which is pretty much the prime employer through itself and all of its state-run subsidiary companies, basically sent a huge number of its own workforce in what could be moderately described as forced labor. I mean, it's not like they put AK-47s behind their backs and said, "You work or we shoot you," but it was definitely incentivized labor, shall we say. They sent a huge number of government workers out into the fields to contribute to the agricultural production because at that point, and I believe this was about a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago that this program was announced, it was already becoming clear at that point that food shortages were going to just keep getting worse and worse and worse.
You're looking at me. I think that it would have been safe for Venezuela to have not done necessarily that, but to have gotten to a point a long time ago that they were possibly self-sufficient to where, because they don't produce a lot of food. Most of their milk is even imported. Pretty much everything that you might need is imported into Venezuela. They export a lot of oil. That's 90% of their exports, and that's actually over 50% of their GDP is just what they export.
We're gonna come back to that later as well, I'm sure. But I'm gonna go back to that interview with Torres. I just thought it was a very interesting interview. He was saying that when they finally did take control, they were starting all these government programs to give to the poor, and he felt that they should have industrialized the country so they can produce what they are importing now. And he was talking about agriculture, he was talking about milk, he was talking about basic necessities. But instead, they redistributed the wealth, and it did not happen to work out for the best of them.
Right. And, that's one thing that we've seen. I'd like to come back to this a little later when we get back to the oil production, because there is a very interesting point to be made there. Venezuela is certainly out of the socialist nations on this planet that have gone economically down the tubes. It has done so in the most spectacular fashion I think we've ever seen. It's usually a much slower process. And part of that is the fact that they have done almost nothing to economically diversify. So, for example, the old USSR, which was much, much more hard line, one of the primary goals of the Stalin era and the Khrushchev era was the industrialization of Russia, followed by, in the Brezhnev era, the production of consumer goods. Granted, to meet with pent-up demand that had been there for 20 years. I mean, that is one of the problems that you have in that sort of state-run environment, that individual innovation isn't really encouraged to the same degree. But we have seen other socialist systems that have adjusted much, much better with much more diversified economies. Venezuela failed to do that, and they ended up being the perfect marriage of a one-commodity economy and a low-innovation environment, and that's what we're seeing the result of right now.
Actually, weren't you going to bring that up with, with that kind of economy, it wouldn't matter if you were capitalist or socialist, it would have failed.
Well, that's something of a pretty point. You are absolutely right. Given our current commodity situation on the planet, any economy that is heavily invested into commodities, especially just one commodity as Venezuela is going to suffer some problems. Now, the problem with that is that in the socialist environment that currently defines Venezuela's economic system, it's very hard for people to start new businesses. It's very hard for people to, in other words, react to demand trends, to react to economic trends. And instead, what you end up with is the state determining what businesses are going to have resources allocated to them. And I think what you end up with in that situation is a system in which it's very, very difficult for innovation within the private sector to actually manifest as what would normally be economic diversification.
That system also sounds like a breeding ground of corruption and cronyism.
And that absolutely is the case in Venezuela, as it has been in several other countries, both capitalist and socialist, throughout the world for centuries.
Right, but when it comes to government wielding that much control, that much power,
Correct.
It just seems like
right. And when you have a government that wields that much economic control, you also end up very badly hurting the private sector, which even in more moderate socialist systems, so more like the Scandinavian model, the European model, what we typically see is that a certain degree of socialism can be maintained with a strong private sector to buffer against this kind of problem that we're seeing in Venezuela. Since the Venezuelan government has effectively gutted the private sector, we're actually seeing the effects being much, much worse than they would be otherwise.
I'm not convinced that a capitalist society would do well, or better in this situation. I'm with Austyn here, or maybe you changed your mind all of a sudden, but it's not a problem of capitalism or socialism. It's just something that happened when you have one commodity. I like to think of our town, Peoria, Illinois, where our entire city is based around a Caterpillar. So Caterpillar is now slowly moving out of the country. They tried outsourcing to China a decade or two ago, and now they're trying to outsource to Mexico. A lot of people are getting laid off, fired, forced to retire early. I know people personally who are being forced to retire. And what we're seeing is a lot of people businesses are soon they're losing business, and soon they might go out of business completely. It would start with, I would say, probably higher-end restaurants, people that are directly affected by the higher-ups in Caterpillar. And then after they go out of business, there's less business because there are people with less people with jobs. Then other places eat, and then, I don't know, hair-cutting places, bowling alleys would go out of business. And just slowly, less and less people have jobs, less and less money is going into the economy, so on and so forth.
Now, what you're describing is actually the business cycle in a nutshell.
Yes,
and you are right that it's a phenomenon that occurs regardless of the system that's in place in any given country's economy. With that said, there are contributing factors that make it either better or worse. Certainly the lack of diversification in Venezuela's economy was a huge contributing factor. But with that said, again, in a system where you have that much state power over the economic system, what you're going to end up with is a situation where people, companies, small business owners will be almost completely incapable of using entrepreneurial innovation to respond to those economic trends. So, for example, going back to your example of Peoria, you are right. We used to be very dependent on Caterpillar, and prior to that, very dependent on distilleries and brewing companies. Now, those have all moved out. Caterpillar's in the process of moving out, and what we're now seeing is that we are actually experiencing a transition to the medical industry. Now, if businesses were not able to open up, private businesses, and support businesses to support the staffs that those businesses then necessarily require, where would Peoria be at this current moment? We would actually really be exactly as you were describing, in a situation where people were losing jobs and then having absolutely no opportunity to either gain new skills or to diversify into other sectors of the economy. And we really would be in a perpetual downward spiral that would have virtually no solution. We'd be in Venezuela.
Yes. We have a better shot because we have more time, since Caterpillar is phasing out gradually. Sure. But I don't think that Peoria itself right now, I mean, it's hard for a city, I mean, especially a medium-sized city, even though we do have a lot of farming and sort of the surrounding areas, we couldn't be necessarily self-sufficient, whereas Venezuela, although a smaller country, had they put enough resources and time into it early on, say even just, when Hugo Chavez came into power, they would probably be okay right now.
Comes down to a planning thing, is what you're saying.
Yes. They're still socialist. Venezuela is still socialist, but the government still has to compete in a capitalist global economy. And what we saw was the oil prices dropped drastically.
During the recession, is what you mean? Or are you
yes, they steadily increased again, and then they dropped, and they wanted to be not as dependent on the United States, and so they tried to go to China to get some business from China, and I want to say India. And what happened was, maybe it was Russia. It doesn't matter. Anyway, China and some other country, and these two, Russia produces their own oil, a lot of it. I'm digressing. So these countries, though, needed a lot more oil, but then the economies kind of stabilized. They weren't in progressive need for oil. The rates weren't climbing. They kind of steadied, and so they didn't have to produce as much. Iran decided that they weren't going to produce less to help bring the prices up, because they thought, well, we can produce oil for only about $5 a barrel and then, sell it for whatever the price is. So we're not going to stop producing as much so that other countries can benefit, because that's not going to help us. They also have huge reserves of cash and oil, so that wouldn't help them at all. So prices just went down, and because that's, most of their GDP in Venezuela, they don't have money.
So what you're saying is, once the oil prices went down, that's when they started really spiraling.
Yes.
Okay. And is that, from what I was hearing from you, it started in 2000. Yeah, that about correlates.
So certainly the oil spiral was what triggered the massive economic crisis that they're in right now. The conditions that caused that started much, much earlier. Venezuela's always had a high inflation rate. Even prior to Chavez, it had a high inflation rate. The inflation that we have seen thanks to their currency controls, which they do not allow their currency to float freely on the open Forex market, has been really second. I can only think of one other country that has ever experienced anything even remotely like that, and that is Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe's rule. Now, here again, this goes back to whether or not you're encouraging a dynamic economy that can self-adjust for economic trends. So there is certainly the accusation that the state, maintaining state controls, could have done a better job in terms of still maintaining the state control and diversifying the economy. But whenever you have a state control, especially in a very bureaucratic country like Venezuela, what you're going to end up with is a very long response time. So as soon as these industries were nationalized, and oil was the first one, but when the construction industry was nationalized, when the tourist industry was nationalized, when all of these industries were nationalized, we suddenly created, or Venezuela, I should say, suddenly created a system in which it was going to be very, very difficult to respond to real-time economic stimuli, especially when you had sort of an ideological system of Chavez and later Maduro leading the country rather than a simply economics-based system.
I would blame a lot of that on the incredible instability. We talked earlier, not on the show, so I shouldn't say we talked earlier. I should just say it like it's the first time I'm saying it. What happened was the president, who was it who Chavez was cooing against?
Oh boy, I forget which one it was on that one.
Okay, anyway,
There were a lot of presidents getting ousted at that point in South America.
He started out, especially when he was being cooed against by Chavez, as more or less what we might consider right-wing, probably the Venezuelan equivalent to right-wing politics. And he kind of flipped towards the end, more towards liberal, and then the guy after him, who actually released Chavez from prison, he started also as more or less the right wing, and then 2 years, he started in 1994. 2 years later, in 1996, he completely flipped to being the sort of neoliberalism.
You're looking for neoliberal economics.
Yes.
So after the model of Augusto Pinochet in Chile.
Yes, and what I'm saying is there's so much capitalist, socialist, so much flipping back and forth, and there's a lot of, and we mentioned this earlier, I think, in the podcast, like rioting and protesting going on, right, just all of South America. And so, yeah, there's, the economy is going to be pretty... I mean, people are using the oil industry as a political tool to get what they want. Whenever they're upset about whatever it may be, they'll just strike and not work. And then, if that's 50% of the annual GDP, over 50%, we're going to have problems economically.
Actually, if I may, in Venezuela, no one has to strike. The labor protections under the Chavez and later the Maduro administrations have become so vehement that... in fact, you cannot fire people for failing to show up to work.
Yeah. Well, either way, they're not producing money if people are striking. In 2002 and early 2003, people were striking. And way back in 1996, when I was talking about earlier, there was a huge strike then as well.
Now, one thing that's interesting to note, because it's sort of interesting to bring up another country for reference that is similar in many ways to Venezuela, is its immediate neighbor to the west, which is Colombia. Colombia has a very similar economic profile to Venezuela in terms of its resources. It is not as oil-rich as Venezuela, but it is quite oil-wealthy. It has similar agricultural exports, similar climate, etc., etc. Much like Venezuela, it's a moderately developed South American country. Certainly there are large sections that are undeveloped. It has pursued a free market policy, has embraced international trade, has very much so gone the route of promoting private enterprise, especially in the importing sector, and has steadily grown at 4 to 5% GDP for most of the period during which Venezuela has been struggling immensely. So we're looking at two very similar countries with two very different results.
I don't know about Venezuela's production of illegal narcotics, but I know Colombia is known for that.
Correct. Yes, they are. But you have to remember that even as institutionalized as that is in Colombia, those productions are never actually reported on the official government data. That's the unofficial books that they don't let me see.
Right. It's still, that's money in the country that gets spent on legal goods.
Yeah, it absolutely is. But at the same time, you still have to consider that no matter how great the narco industry is in Colombia, you're looking at two very different economic systems with almost polar opposite results. And I don't think you can say that a single industry was the result or the cause of that result.
I would like to argue that Colombia is also well known for, similar to India, because I know a lot of people have seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, little children working in dumps trying to earn the little bit of money they can for the little bit of food they get. When I went to Peoria Christian High School, they sent missionary teams over there to help these children and to help earn them money so that they could eat. Now, before the whole problems with starving in Venezuela, where people are literally eating garbage, there weren't a whole lot of people working in dumps, children working in dumps, whereas in Colombia there are. And I would argue that in really strong capitalist societies where there's a lot of free market stuff going on, we see that. We see a lot of poor people as well as a lot of rich people. I don't know. You want to take it from there?
Yeah, I actually would like to, because you are now. I want to say first off, you are correct. There are some poor working conditions in Colombia. Much like in Venezuela, they were starting from a relatively low baseline of development back in about the middle of the 20th century. Now, here's what happens when you actually bring money in the form of foreign investment into a country through imports, through free trade, etc., etc. And this is what we're seeing in Colombia right now. Living wages tend to go up. So even China, which is fairly state-run, but which does embrace the idea of competition within its own internal marketplace, has seen a massive explosion in the actual living wage earned by Chinese workers since the United States, since the UK, since France, etc., started to produce their goods there. Anytime money comes into a country, it does take some time, but it will eventually work its way down into the labor market. It has to move down
I have
first.
a question for you there.
Sure.
Since they're not reporting their numbers accurately, as far as GDP goes, how sure are we that that's completely true?
We can be fairly sure on that because of independent economic surveys. This is granted China does report its own numbers on that, but we can also basically just look at consumer spending in China, which we can then use to get at least a rough estimate of the wage. Is it 100% accurate? No. But can we get the idea that, say, since 1980, 1985, the wages have gone up considerably in China thanks to foreign investment? Absolutely. We can see the trend over the long period.
If I can, real quick, Apple's in a lot of trouble right now because a lot of their factory workers in China are killing themselves because of low economic conditions.
Sure.
That's it, just sure.
Yeah, I mean, you're
talking about kids working in dumps, people killing themselves in China because of these free market conditions where people are so poor that they have to submit themselves to this sort of thing.
Except that here's what you're missing. Here's the critical point you're missing. Under every circumstance that you've just described, money is coming into the country. Money can only do two things, unless you bury it in the ground. But if it's in a modern financial system, money can only do two things. It can be spent or it can be invested. In either situation, it actually goes toward producing more economic value within the region that it is either spent or invested. Now, let's take Colombia, let's take China. You're right, there are some fairly bad conditions. But those conditions, in terms of the economics, in terms of the wages, in terms of the upward pressure on those wages, have been consistently rising with the long-term trend of foreign investment. Whereas in Venezuela, what do we see? We see a large amount of wealth that was redistributed, and I've always said capitalism takes a while to work, socialism works for a while. In Venezuela, we see a large amount of wealth redistributed, the country's doing incredibly well for a while, educational conditions go up, healthcare conditions go up, economic conditions go up, until the result of all of this comes down, until the lack of innovation, until the lack of economic diversity, until all of that comes down, and you end up with a condition where not only are the people living in exactly the same level of squalor, there is also no foreign investment coming in that can even have a chance of trickling down to those people. So rather than an upward pressure from a low point that does take some time to trickle down, I'm not saying it doesn't, but instead of that, you're actually advocating for a situation in which there simply is no money to even have a chance at trickling down.
All right, if I may, real quick, you talked about trickling down, which is something that Ronald Reagan liked to say, and we all know Ronald Reagan he's my favorite president. Oh, he's so great. Ronald Reagan.
Sarcasm central here.
All right,
it's okay, I just like Ronald Reagan for a lot of reasons myself.
So he talked about trickle-down economics a lot, and through that we saw the rich getting richer, which is great. I'm all, rich can get richer all they want, but we also saw the poor getting poorer, and we still see that today. And we are a capitalist country, more or less, and the poor here continue to get poorer. We have, although we see the minimum wage go up here and there, and we're trying to push it up even more with inflation. It's not going up. I agree with Venezuela. They needed a diversification of the wealth, and they could have spent their money better. I'll give you that as well.
Better.
What?
Much better.
Much better. Yeah, it was some poor management on their part. But hypothetically, if they had better economists, that's the word, running things there, they could have done fine with the socialist system. All they needed was to be able to be self-sufficient in case their main source of GDP fell through like it did. So if they were able to support themselves just based on the agriculture that they could produce, then we wouldn't have had people starving.
Now, that's also ignoring the immense amounts of social spending that was done from exclusively oil-based. In other words, you would have actually needed a similar amount of money that was coming in oil, because Venezuela, and again, I'm saying this is incredibly imprudent whether you're a socialist or a capitalist, didn't save any of the money that was coming in from the oil. They didn't put any of it. Norway, which is very moderately socialist, has what's called the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is basically a setback of, I forget how much money it is, but it's a very considerable amount for exactly that type of situation. But in order to actually do what you're saying, Venezuela would have needed to develop its economy to the point that it effectively had a secondary influx of GDP wealth almost identical to that of the oil wealth in order to take over from it, because they were literally spending almost everything that they brought in on oil production on social spending and other similar programs.
He was talking about diversification. I don't think he was talking about so much getting money in. He wanted to cut back on imports.
If the state could run itself by giving agriculture that it produces to the people, if that were enough to feed the people alone, even if they still say needed to import clothing, people could go a long time with only the clothing that they have.
Right, but my point is that you're talking about consumer goods spending exclusively and ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the massive cost of spending in Venezuela. Taxation there runs between company and employee 25% for social services, and that's in a country that supposedly has enough GDP coming in from its oil sales to meet all of its requirements. They also have a very large amount of debt, and they also continued to spend even after 2011 when hyperinflation began to occur. At any point, they could have stopped the spending. So my point is, when you have systems like this, when you have guaranteed healthcare, when you have guaranteed education, when you have minimum wages that, now granted this is mostly due to hyperinflation, but that go up 10, 20 times over the course of a few years, you need to have a way to pay for those systems, because if you simply say, hey, we don't have enough money to do this, you've effectively made a contractual agreement with the people of Venezuela, and they have to continue to fund those programs even at this point. And when the money does finally run out, which I expect will not be very long, and in fact people are currently dying in Venezuela because the non-privatized healthcare system, because there isn't a privatized healthcare system, can't even begin to get medicine into them. So no matter how much money you have in Venezuela, you could be the richest person in Venezuela, and you could not get medicine for your medical conditions. At some point you have to say that you've made the people too dependent upon the state, and if there is even the slightest chance that any industry on its own cannot pay for those obligations, you need to seriously reevaluate your spending, because any industry and or all industries can take serious hits at any point in global economics.
I guess what I'm saying is it's more the lack of diversification as well as some incredible mismanagement that is the problem, not at all socialism. I think personally that socialism, and I don't mean capitalism, because I fear that a lot of people link those two closer together, because I am in no way a communist. Did I say capitalism there?
Yeah. You did say cap, and I honestly wondered, I kind of wondered where you were going with that. I was like, do people link capitalism and socialism closely together?
Communism, excuse me.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, okay.
So,
sorry, proceed with your thought.
I think we can all agree that communism is not an effective form of government.
Yeah, especially if you're talking about classical Marxism-Leninism as separate from Marxist socialism.
Yes. So, anywho, I'm just going to sum up my points, because then I'm done. If Venezuela had produced enough agricultural goods to feed themselves in this sort of situation as sort of an emergency, then they would have been okay. Also, if the people were had some privatization of, say, the concrete business. Oil is okay, I guess, for that situation for them, but they should have spent their money better. Anyway, if everybody's kind of in the middle somewhere as far as economically, I'm more happy for that than, say, if everything's privatized and there are a lot of really rich people and some really poor people that are killing themselves because of financial distress, or children are working in dumps. I think that everybody being kind of on more or less the same page economically in the middle, I think that's far more what's the word I'm looking for?
Beneficial?
No,
Prudent?
but we'll use that one.
How about prudent?
That's not the word either, but both work.
Okay, so for my closing thoughts, I would basically just say let's look at empirical data and empirical results. Take Colombia and Venezuela, two countries that in their economic profile have some differences but are very similar in many regards, and see which system is working better. Colombia, which is not a fully capitalist country, it does have some welfare state to it, and that has been a major issue for the current administration in Colombia. Let's look at their successes economically, growing during this period, versus the total failure. And I think all three of us can agree that Venezuela at this point, whether we agree on the reasons or not, Venezuela is in almost complete economic collapse. Yeah. So I would say to look at those two models and see which one has actually produced the best empirical results in the laboratory of a nation state.
All right. Some of my final thoughts, and it might be incoherent a little bit.
I want to hear exactly, describe really well what you think.
All right. Venezuela, obviously a failure. We definitely disagree on the reasons. The redistribution of wealth was. I don't actually know much about socioeconomics of Venezuela when Chavez took over. However, if they were anything like the barons back in the day, industrialist era, talking early 20th century America, I can understand why the people took over the government. And that's what Chavez, according to Torres, the guy that I keep quoting here, he said that Chavez, if anything, was a man of the people. You can disagree with that if you want. I don't know much about the guy other than he's on t-shirts.
I think you're thinking of Che Guevara there.
Am I? Okay.
Yeah, the guy whose profile, or not profile, but whose face is really famous
You're
on
right.
t-shirts.
You're right.
Yeah, that's Che Guevara.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
Is that kind of racist?
No,
Okay.
no, they actually did look somewhat similar. He had the mustache thing going on.
Did Chavez wear a beret?
Yes, he did.
Okay,
Sometimes.
I
at
don't
least.
feel as bad
Okay.
now. However, I will say that comparing Colombia and Venezuela, it seems a little off to me. I'm not sure that even if their resources are the same, the way they approach them from an investment standpoint is a little different. I understand that capitalists, they can respond to situations better. However, for Venezuela to not plan at all for their diversification, for their agricultural needs, and to place all of their bets on one horse, I don't care if you're capitalist or socialist, it doesn't matter. You're going to fail in that situation. However, I will agree with Duncan that the recovery period for a capitalist society would occur far quicker just because they can. However, again, looking at other socialist countries, I don't want to say France because they're doing horrible. Let's say the Scandinavians, as you quoted, if they just took some of that money, put it back, stopped endless spending, I just wish our country, America, would do that as well. However, I digress. Endless spending in any country is unneeded. So plan better, I guess, is my whole point here. I guess I'm trying to make. Does that make any sense?
Yes, so you're saying that even though they are socialist, if they had planned better, they would still be okay today and they would be okay for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, it
Given
just makes
that-
sense. Veloso used to say it all the time, the 7 P's of success. Proper prior planning prevents pitiful poor performance. I still hear his voice in my head when I say that.
No, so do I. Just for anyone listening, we're referring to one of our high school teachers.
A very strict man. Very organized, though.
Good guy, though.
Yeah, very good guy. It just feels that leadership really failed Venezuela this time around. That's my entire thought.
If I can, just curious about what you think about what Duncan and I were arguing about, looking at Colombia and China, two more or less socialist countries. Not Colombia, not socialist, but countries that have a high divide between rich and poor. Do you think that even though there may be, according to Duncan, a rise in wages and living conditions, probably a little bit more in China, but not enough for my taste. But do you think that, I don't know, which would you argue is better, or is better in the long run?
I could be wrong in this, but every time I've seen a rise in wages, I've seen a rise in the cost of living as well. That naturally goes up too, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
As a general rule, the two are directly related, although not by an exact 1-to-1 ratio proportion.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So I definitely empathize with the idea that Venezuela was going towards. I don't agree with their methods at all. I really hate to see children taken advantage of in any society. That's a theme that you'll find just makes me mad right off the
well,
bat.
that's in Colombia, and you were talking about Venezuela there.
Yeah, sorry I didn't. I'm talking about China and Colombia in particular when I say abuses to children. Wow, that was
It's all right. It's all right.
a Johnson-esque gaffe right there.
What is Aleppo?
Child's. So I guess I am a little American in that I'm comfortable with most of our basic labor laws that restrict children from being taken advantage of, that restrict horrible working conditions, that guarantee a very basic net that you can live off of. However, I'm with Duncan in the fact that it can be a little too easy to become dependent on those.
And it should be pointed out again that there are, capitalism, socialism, it's a very wide spectrum, and there are a lot of points on that. So, I mean, Colombia does have something of a welfare state, and that's actually been increasing under the current administration. So it's not like it's a 100% capitalist or 100% communist. Actually, we were discussing before the beginning of the show, no society on Earth has ever been 100% one or the other.
Absolutely. We'll get into that debate another time, though. I think that'll wrap it up for this time on The Mind. I'm Austyn.
Good evening, I'm Duncan Ryan.
And I am Bryce Stilson.
All right, join us next week on The Mind.